Morning all. Hope you are all doing well. Just wanted to give you guys another video. We're going to talk about something new today, kind of shifting gears away from what we were talking about last week, which was taxonomy, so how we organize different organisms. But today we're going to take a closer look at some of those organisms. We're going to take a look at these two words here. We have invertebrates and vertebrates. More specifically today, I'm just going to take a real quick look at what these things vertebrates are. You might have heard of this term before. But yeah, we'll go ahead and dive in real quick. But real quick, before we get started, some learning objectives. These will be over the course of the next week or so. I'm not going to do it all today. So define the key terms vertebrate and invertebrate, so knowing what those are and how to define them and how to identify them. Classifying living things as either a vertebrate or an invertebrate. So some things can be classified into these two categories, and if I were to give you one and say, is this a vertebrate or an invertebrate, you'd be able to tell me. And then compare and contrast vertebrates and invertebrates. So the differences between those two groups, and there are a lot, and we'll talk about those over the coming days. Kind of going back to last week's video, so we had this organizer over here talking about domains, kingdom, phylum, class, etc., etc. Just a real quick reminder that we have 3 different domains. That's the biggest groups, and that's bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And today we need to focus on eukarya, but more specifically, we're going to go down to the kingdom within eukarya. We're going to talk about animalia. So we're going to go into the kingdom of animalia. So we are going to be talking about animals today, specifically animals. So animals, all animals, are in the domain of eukarya and in the kingdom of animalia. Every animal that we know, and then we know that there are 5 major classes. So we have amphibians here, fish, birds, mammals, and reptiles. And I have no doubt that all of you have heard about all 5 different things on that list there. But there is, and they all look very different. If you take a picture of a frog and you compare it to a crow, they look very different, right? But what do they all have in common? They do all have something, they have something in common. And that would be that they all have a backbone or some kind of structure on their back that holds their nerves and stuff like that. So they are all this term called a vertebrate. They have their vertebrae in their back. If you ever look at your back, a picture of your back, you can see like the little slits in the back there. And every animal, whether it's an amphibian like a frog, a fish, bird, mammals like us, or a reptile, they all have a backbone of some sort or a vertebrate. If we take a picture, this is an x-ray of a frog. You can, over here, you kind of see the whole x-ray. You see there's this little line going down its back. And if you zoom in even more, you'll see that it has something that looks very similar to a human x-ray. You know, you have, if you've ever seen a human x-ray, they have this spinal column, and that's how all 5 major classes of animals, these 5 over here, they all have this in common to some extent. They all have something that looks like this. And so then we can call anything that has this kind of backbone structure would be a vertebrate. So if we want to break down these vertebrates a bit, we'll talk about each one very briefly. We can talk about amphibians. Amphibians are like your frogs, anything that kind of lives in between both water and land. So they have a few things in common. They usually have a very moist skin, so it's kind of wet to the touch. They go through some kind of metamorphosis. So if you guys have ever caught those little tadpoles, they turn into frogs over time. So they change drastically. Like I said, they live on both land and water. And then very specifically, the way we can describe different kinds of animals is the way they give birth. So these ones, amphibians, they lay these wet, soft eggs. They don't really have a shell like you think of a chicken egg. The shell is very soft. You could break it very easily. So these 4 things, and there's more, there's way more than this, but these 4 things are 4 big ways that we can describe amphibians. Next would be fish. So again, hopefully you know or seen a fish before, and we have some examples here. You have Nemo over here. They live in water full time, so they cannot survive without being in water for an extended period of time. They breathe through gills, and that's important, and I'll explain to you why that's so important in a second. So they have to breathe through these structures on the side of their heads usually, where they have to be in the water. They breathe through the water. They get oxygen from the water, and they breathe through these structures called gills, and they will lay their eggs in water. They might look similar to your amphibians' eggs, but that's just important that they will lay their eggs in water. Next, we have mammals. And so the reason I was so specific about the gills on the fish is because over here we have a killer whale or an orca. And it might look like a fish and might have some similar characteristics to a fish, like it lives in water. But a lot of the rest of it's very different. They don't breathe through gills. They have to come back up to the surface and breathe through, their blowhole. And so they can't breathe water. They have to go back up to the surface and get air. So they are very different from fish. Not only that, but so notice my second point here. They give live birth. So these whales, any kind of whale, isn't a fish. It's a mammal because they have to breathe the air out. But they give live birth. They don't lay eggs. And a lot of these rules might have some exceptions. For example, have hair. That's just if you see something that has hair, like this panda here, or a monkey, or your dog, it's probably a mammal. But not all mammals are necessarily going to have hair, like our orca over here. And they produce milk. So when these mammals have babies, they will feed it with some kind of milk. For example, breast milk, or these, you ever seen a dog give birth to puppies? It's nursing the puppies by laying on its side. They produce some kind of milk for that baby to feed off of when it's very young. So those are just some key terms and key factors to being a mammal. Lastly, we have reptiles. So they are very different from amphibians. Some people get them mixed up. You might think a frog is a reptile, but it's not necessarily. Or you might think a crocodile is an amphibian because it lives in both water and land, but it's not technically. A big thing about these reptiles is that they're cold-blooded. And what that means is they don't have a way to heat their insides necessarily. Like we don't have to sit out in the sun to keep ourselves warm, right? We can sit inside of a room and we can stay alive without being in the sun to heat our blood and our insides, right? So that's one key term to reptiles. They have dry scales. So like I said, with amphibians, they usually have moist, scaly skin. But reptiles don't necessarily. They'll be much drier. Like if you see that crocodile here, even though it lives on kind of both on land and in water, it's pretty dry most of the time when it comes out. And like this chameleon here, pretty dry. And they give a different kind of birth. Whereas the amphibians would lay their eggs and they're kind of moist and they have soft shells. These reptiles will lay shelled, leathery eggs, but they're much harder. So again, not necessarily all reptiles will have all these factors, but it's just some good ways to tell, is it a reptile, is it an amphibian? You can kind of go, okay, no, you know what, it has dry scales, it's cold-blooded, I think, and it lays shelled, leathery eggs, it's probably a reptile. Whereas if we go back to amphibians, if I were to give you something that says, it has moist skin, it probably went through some kind of metamorphosis, and it lays wet, soft eggs, it's probably an amphibian. Right. So that's very quickly, very briefly, vertebrates, and then the 5 different kinds of animals. So real quick, I'm going to end this video with a learning check. So what you guys are going to do is you're going to take these 5 questions here on the right, and you're going to send me the response. So what makes an animal a vertebrate? What is the defining factor that I said in the start of this video that makes an animal a vertebrate? Give me one defining factor of each of the 5 different kinds of animals. That's just really going back and taking one of those points that I pointed out just briefly and sending that back to me just to make sure you're paying attention. Provide one example of a vertebrate. That could be anything we've talked about in this video or something you come up with your own. Provide one example of an invertebrate. So we haven't talked about them yet. So that one might take a bit more research. But using what you know about what makes an animal a vertebrate, you might be able to answer this one. What do you think the term invertebrate means? So if vertebrate means that it has this structure, I don't want to give away the answer to the first question, but if it has this, what do you think in, which means the opposite or does not have, what do you think the term invertebrate means? So 5 questions, pretty easy. This video is not very long. Watch the video, answer the questions, send those back to me, and we'll be all set to go. And thanks for listening, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.